a country like South Africa has a very big resource and reserve base. But if you think about it, does it really constitute a massive advantage for us when we compete against the likes of India, China, and others in relation to our downstream beneficiation industries, jewelry fabrication, catalytic converter fabrication, etc.? Because if you think about it, the price of those commodities is determined on international markets, and you can buy the product in Tel Aviv, New York, Antwerp, Shanghai, Mumbai, and Johannesburg at roughly the same price. It costs roughly 25 US cents to transport an ounce of platinum or an ounce of gold to London. So you can basically get the product at roughly the same internationally determined price. What's interesting to us is that the vast majority of manufacturing beneficiation takes place in countries where the market's located, and often those countries are not actually very big miners at all, because the issues that affect downstream fabrication are much different to the issues that affect countries which are mining intensive. And so from our perspective, having the minerals doesn't necessarily give you an advantage over the Indians or over the Chinese or over the Americans, etc., in terms of fabricating jewelry or cutting diamonds, as an example. For bulk commodities, a similar concept applies, although obviously there are transport differentials, and it very much depends on the effectiveness of your transport system. So if you look at intermediate products like steel, you do have differential pricing, but that's not because the raw material is necessarily priced differently. It's because of the transport-related issues. And South Africa is relatively geographically isolated versus the rest of the world. So I guess the issue on the beneficiation of the bulk commodities is much more the definition of what happens at the intermediate product level in terms of final fabrication industries. So we just look at diamonds. Most of the countries that produce the diamonds are no longer the fabricators. Botswana has now got a bigger cutting industry. I just need to update this particular slide, but let me just quickly slip onto the gold one, which is a 2012 data set. China's possibly one of the major exceptions. China and the US, they are very big gold producing countries. China is now the world's biggest gold producing country, but they fabricate a lot more gold than they actually mine, and that's obviously consumed in their domestic marketplace because they've got a massive marketplace and they're very competitive at fabricating it. But there's many countries that produce the gold and don't necessarily fabricate it into jewelry. On the right-hand side of the scale, you've got countries that have almost no gold mining. Most of them have none at all, and yet are very big fabricators. Again, it's because of the manufacturing advantages that they've got vis-a-vis having the minerals. Again, the raw material doesn't necessarily give you the advantage. It's rather what can you do at a competitive advantage level to drive the process. And the same thing on the AutoCAD side. I'm sorry, the graph is a little bit dated, but the reason that we've got a bit of platinum fabrication, and this was the 2007 data, more recently it's down to 13% of global supply on catalytic converters, is because of the old MIDP, which has obviously been replaced with the Automotive Industry Development Plan. So having comparative advantage, having the minerals, doesn't necessarily drive whether you are good or bad at fabricating the downstream stuff, because issues that drive competitiveness in manufacturing are very much driven by competitive production. Do you have the skill sets? Do you have the craftsmanship? Do you have the quality of assurance? Do you have the distribution channels? Do you have all the issues that are very much more firm-specific, located in industries that are very, very competitive? So governments that have indicated or provided environments which are very, very competitive for their manufacturing sectors are the ones that are doing well. And let me explain that a little bit further. Comparative advantage really is something which defines who grows wheat, who produces bauxite or alumina from the aluminium process, as an example, and it's basically related to resource endowment. So when you start going down the list towards competitive advantage, it's much more created by individual firms, and it's much more driven by policy and other factors in terms of the way that it's constructed, and that drives competitive manufacturing. Can you convert comparative advantage into competitive advantage? There's a bit of a gap. Maybe you can do a little bit, but you've got to really focus on the bottom stuff. That's your competitive advantage stuff, and I'll get into that in a moment. So if we look at the key drivers of manufacturing beneficiation, and this is a summary of a lot of work that's been done over the last 20 years. We've had platinum beneficiation committees. We've had the Kaiser-sponsored study process through the Fridge study and NEDLAC, looking at all these different things. You want to grow it, you've got to have a significant entrepreneurial base. You've got to have very competitive production. Craftsmanship and specific skills to be able to produce what the world wants. Access to markets. And most of the large fabrication markets tend to have quite a big domestic market in their own right. Good market intelligence. There's no point in producing something that the rest of the world doesn't want. You have to know what the Americans want. You have to know what the Europeans want, etc., etc. You have to have low cost of doing business, and that implies smart tape, not red tape. You don't want all these licensing conditions for small manufacturers, etc., which ends up bogging them down instead of liberating them. You've got to have low material funding costs. A lot of the focus in South Africa is about access to materials. This is the issue, in my view, which really drives the ability of fabricators to compete. Special economic zones, it's very interesting to see that the National Treasury has produced a draft special economic zone bill, and that's quite interesting because that's a step certainly in the right direction. These have to be duty-free, VAT-free, and low tax rate areas. In the area of diamond cutting and polishing, we actually do import quite a lot of diamonds. And the diamonds that are imported carry a 14% VAT rate for 3 or 4 months until SARS decide to refund the fabricators, the diamond cutters and polishers. That's a heck of a disadvantage relative to the Indians and the Chinese who don't carry that type of financing cost. Quality assurance, you have to have quality assurance in play, because if you don't, your product won't be acceptable in global markets. You obviously have to continually strive on the research and development side, and then you have to obviously have appropriate and competitively priced infrastructure, because if you can't get the product to market at competitive prices, you're not going to be in the game. So these are a whole lot of issues which are mostly driven at a manufacturing competitive advantage level.